When I first started this project, I was thinking, what is it about urban fantasy that I like? And I realized that it's this fascinating gray area. The term itself has been used in many different conversations, referring to disparate scholarly subjects. So, for the sake of your time and my sanity, this is not an exhaustive essay on the subgenre, but merely an amalgamation of interesting research I've done into the topic, specifically in regards to the modern media, the process of adaptation, and the relation of urban fantasy to the fantasy genre as a whole. My working definition is inspired by an article from Elber Avram. The adaptive nature of urban fantasy pulls on existing work, typically existing mythology or other religious iconography, the fantastical element, and places it in a modern, urbanized city structure, generating conflict between the old ways of the mythical figure and the current year setting. Alternatively, the mythic nature of fantasy can originate from the urban environment as a conglomeration of old ideas recontextualized to fit the new narrative structure. Because of this, fantasy can be labeled derivative of the pure original context, but that ignores not only the building process of human language, learning, and society, but also the way humans tell stories. I bring this up mostly as a means of nipping any conversation on genre purity in the bud. We're not interested in that right now. That being said, fantasy is one of fiction's largest and fastest growing genres. While there are many definitions, a generous approach to the genre includes any work that contains magic or other elements that cannot be understood by the rules of reality. Among the subgenres, these key traits in fantasy have to remain for it to be a fantastical story. This is not the same as science fiction, though at one time sci fi was part of the fantasy family. Now it's more of a distant cousin that went to the STEM field, while the rest of the family were a mixed bag of dramatics, historians, and linguists. Sci fi has generated its own branches at this point, and is distinguished from fantasy by the presence of supernaturally powerful or present technology. As a rule of thumb, if it can be explained by in universe science, science from reality, or aliens, it's sci fi. Of course, there are works that overlap this line. The Matrix, for example, could be considered science fantasy in that there's a scientific basis for what's happening, there's a logic in the system, but at the same time, the story clings to religious metaphor and presents, within the natural world of the simulation, a kind of prophecy about Neo, especially later installments in the series. This tow line between sci fi and fantasy becomes an interesting point of philosophical contention that I might cover in a later video. Doing that here would just take me forever. Traits common with other subgenres or story structures are also observable in the urban fantasy. Cop dramas, for example, seem to be a favorite of the zeitgeist. Grimm is a series first released in 2012, presenting an adaptation of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, among other myths from disparate regions. It is urban in that it takes place in Portland, Oregon, and fantasy in that potions, spells, mythical creatures, superhuman powers, and the presence of a greater evil force, all strong tropes of fantasy, also exist. The serialized cop drama gives a structure to individual episodes, while the fantastic story elements are incorporated into every aspect of the show, up to and including the main character, Nick Burkhardt, who is himself a semi-human entity called a Grimm. The conflict comes into play when the Kehrseite, the term for regular people in the Grimm series, encounter or are affected by the supernatural world. There is a separation insofar as regular people do not know about the supernatural world and have been shown to experience great emotional and mental distress when confronted by it. However, unlike the similar trope in other series, Harry Potter, for example, the mundane and the supernatural are not separated worlds. They are concurrent, conflicted existences, wherein humans, and sometimes Wesen, the supernatural creatures, often become collateral damage Nick must resolve. So, how does this fusion of genre tropes make the fantasy elements work in conflict with the natural elements? While Nick sees the world, the full world, he is surrounded by individuals who aren't on the same page. His previous ignorance of the true history of his world and his position as a police officer marks a central point of contention. The Grimm kills Vesson. That's their job. But as a cop, he's responsible for protecting innocent people, Vesson included. His morality is tested again and again by antagonistic supernatural forces and human desperation. The hidden world and hidden history are inextricably connected to the mundane known reality. Ilber Avram has a deep focus on hidden history, comparing the protagonist digging into the hidden world to an archaeologist. This directly parallels a portion of the conflict between the old world, represented by a royal family that once controlled the Grimms, and Nick's group in a race for an ultra-powerful artifact from the Holy Land, sealed away by 7 Grimms who deemed it too dangerous to be in royal hands. Quite literally, there is a treasure hunt in this cop drama. They are physically and metaphorically digging up the past, shifting gears to the adaptation of religious iconography and figures also present in the urban fantasy. American Gods by Neil Gaiman was recently adapted into a TV series. Shadow Moon, the focal character, is just an average human who encounters Wednesday, another main character, and an old god. You might know him as Odin. Yes, that Odin. Wednesday chose Shadow to fulfill the role of a shaman because the older gods are losing power. The people who once worshipped and feared them dwindling in numbers, and newer, more powerful gods, created by the desire of modern people, are trying to wipe out the older gods. This directly highlights the old versus new conflict typical of urban fantasy. Much like Grimm, the supernatural and the natural are concurrent, interrelated states of being. While the conflict between them is overarching, they do not always form the only source of conflict in the respective works. Shadow goes through the shamanistic rites as the story progresses, and it is this shamanistic bridging between the ancient and modern worlds that is so pertinent to American Gods. It's how the viewer is intended to perceive, empathize with, and understand the humanity of the supernatural and the power over the supernatural that we tiny mortals have. While Grimm presents a mix of communicated genres, American Gods is more focused on the fantastical elements. It's an inherently religious experience by incorporating and remixing mythology into a neo-mythos. In this respect, mythification in American Gods is doubly significant and emphasizes that in postmodernism, mythification expresses the unlimited freedom of the contemporary artist vis-a-vis the traditional symbol system, which is no longer a constricting force in modern thought. Urban fantasy and the remixing of our old stories is how humans process our world, contextualize our lives, and communicate the inner realities of our perspective to others. So, why is this important? What impact does this all have on the fantasy genre as a whole? I want to take a moment to really think about the media we consume and what we like. As creative and adaptive beings, humans are going to make diverse works, derivative works. Many authors have come forward in recent years and openly discussed what they think about these derivative works, like fan fiction, fan art, the remixing of public domain works, etc. When we love a story, we want to retell it in a more personal way. This communal retelling has led to genre drift. What happened to science fiction may also happen to urban fantasy as we continue to push at, add, and remix what we love. Both Grimm and American Gods have their roots in classical myths, our modern urban society, and varying degrees of other tropes. Yet these two are totally different stories with totally different scales. One is a cop just trying to do the right thing. The other is a guy who just wanted to take a vacation, getting dragged into a literal war of the gods. Even ongoing reimagining of shows we might have grown up with are coming back in a new way. Studios are less shy of producing more dramatic, soul challenging material in shows that can be enjoyed over a larger audience age. Stranger Things, Legion, and that Sabrina the Teenage Witch remake. All of these are slight variations on urban fantasy, and there are more and more of these coming out. The subgenres of fantasy are getting taken more seriously outside of the tiny fandoms post Internet 2.0. And that's a wonderful thing. I look forward to seeing how the branches on this weird family tree keep splitting. Maybe the next big jump is something science fantasy related to bridge that gap again. And I think we're going to see this in our lifetimes. Well, that's about all I have for right now. One last thing before I forget. I've linked all of my sources in the description. Some of them are a bit more convoluted to try to parse my meaning than others. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day.